Throughout the years, sports and violence have gone hand in hand. The intensity and danger that exists within the nature of most sports has transformed the way many games are played today. The story of violence in sports starts with what most would say is the beginning of competitive sport, the ancient Olympic Games. Though the Games initially took place as a religious festival, they included some pretty violent sports such as chariot racing, wrestling, boxing, and pancration. In chariot races, the charioteers would violently attempt to force their opposition into walls or off their chariot. If a charioteer fell off his chariot, he would be dragged around the arena, which was an exciting sight for the spectators. Wrestling was known as the least violent, despite the tactics that were used by the wrestlers, including breaking fingers, backs, and ribs. The match ended after a competitor scored 3 falls against the opponent. Boxing was regarded as the most violent of the games. Boxers fought in an essentially bare-knuckled fight until one boxer admitted defeat or was unconscious. With no rounds, these matches could violently persist for great amounts of time. Pancration was a combination of the two sports, forming a sport similar to the modern-day MMA, but was like boxing in the fact that it only ended when one surrendered. Blood sports like boxing, wrestling, and pancration still exist today, but with more complex sets of rules. Other violent blood sports like bullfighting became popular throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In bullfights, there is usually a man who runs around distracting and angering the bull until the fight is ended, with a man on horseback stabbing the bull to its death with a sword. The closest American sport to this is bull riding, which is not as violent but equally as dangerous. Several other sports that originated in America also have become known for their violence. For example, baseball was founded in the mid-1800s, and though it isn't observed as being as dangerous as many modern sports, it is responsible for more deaths in children ages 5 to 14 than any other sport. Despite this fact, football has become the most critiqued sport when it comes to violence. Violence is easily found in football, with the focal point of the sport being abnormally large men running into each other at full speed. At the turn of the century, the sport was looked upon with great fear, and one was risking their life if they dared to participate. There was no protective equipment, and injuries that were not uncommon included wrenched spinal cords, crushed skulls, and severely broken ribs that pierced the heart. Obituaries of football players were ran on almost a weekly basis. Many newspapers called for the banishment of football in colleges and high schools. Teddy Roosevelt got involved following the massive outcry against his favorite sport. He revived the Harvard-Yale series after it had been canceled for 2 years due to what was known as the bloodbath at Hampton Park that occurred on field in 1894. He announced his passion for manly, rough games and believed it was what made his Rough Riders so strong and loyal. In 1905, Roosevelt called the coaches from the 3 main college teams, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, to the White House to urge them to set an example of the right way to play the game without violence. The coaches came out publicly against the violence and released a statement condemning brutality and vowing to play clean. Despite his efforts, the country did not conform, and the death toll rose in 1905, leading to many major schools like Stanford and Duke to either switch to rugby or drop football altogether. Roosevelt continued his attempt to save the game, and in 1906, a committee, later known as the NCAA, was created to make changes to the rules that made football a safer and more widely accepted sport. They legalized the forward pass, abolished the dangerous mass formations, created a neutral zone between the offense and the defense, and doubled the first down distance to 10 yards to be gained in 3 downs. The rule changes did not eliminate football's dangers, but fatalities and serious injuries declined greatly from the reforms.
Violence in sports is something that makes sports fun to play and watch, but the severe injuries players were suffering as a result of the sheer violence in sports became significant during the 20th century, and many changes were made. Football has changed dramatically over the years. Football pants were originally baggy, but by the 1940s, the pants were tightened and pads were placed in front of your knees, hips, and thighs to prevent injuries. Another example is shoulder pads. Leather shoulder pads were worn by players in 1910, but the need for more protection led to plastic shoulder pads by the 1960s. Although they were undetected, the worst injuries from football happened to be head trauma injuries. Football helmets have developed tremendously over the years. Originally, football players used leather helmets to protect their heads from significant trauma, but it was well known around the league that players needed better protection, and plastic helmets started to be developed and used in the 1950s. Since the 1950s, face masks and padding has also been added to the helmet, and researchers continue to study ways to improve helmets. Research on head injuries has progressed in the sports world, with owners and league officials putting more money into concussion research. New helmets have been developed to help players withstand the pounding of playing a sport such as hockey. New resistance helmets are being infused with gel-like substances to reduce impact hits, and the NFL has done the same, trying out Kevlar and other materials to make their helmets better. Although new helmets are being made, it's a fact that head injuries and concussions are a very serious thing. The NFL was the first league to take concussions seriously, or at least acted like they did. In 1994, NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue created the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee. Dr. Elliot Pellman was named chairman despite not having any experience with brain injuries. Then after the NFL ignored more and more head injuries, Dr. Bennett Amalu came out with groundbreaking information in 2002 that he had identified CTE in the brain of former Pittsburgh Steelers center Mike Webster, who committed suicide at the age of 50. All signals pointed towards concussions and head trauma in the NFL led to CTE and various other neurological illnesses. Then NFL came back and stated in 2005 that returning to the field after concussion, in quotes, does not involve significant risk of a second injury, either in the same game or during the season. The following year, Dr. Amalu identified CTE in the brains of former Pittsburgh players Terry Long and Andre Waters. Both had committed suicide as well. Problems were arising, and Dr. Elliot Pellman stepped down as the chairman of the Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee in 2007. That same year, NFL finally formalized new concussion guidelines to try to get players off the field when head injuries occurred. Then after several more lawsuits and more suicidal deaths by former NFL players with CTE, such as Ken Stabler or Junior Seau, the NFL finally, on March 14, 2016, publicly acknowledged a connection between football and CTE.